President Donald Trump has expressed mounting frustration with Canada over stalled trade negotiations, according to White House economic advisor Kevin Hassett. The tension escalated on Thursday when Trump abruptly ended discussions between the two nations, citing disagreements and perceived slights during the process. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. Speaking to reporters at the White House on Friday, Hassett, who serves as the director of the National Economic Council, explained that the president's irritation has been building over time. "I think the frustration has built up over time," Hassett said. "The Canadians have been very difficult to negotiate with." When pressed for further details, Hassett pointed to what he described as Canada's lack of flexibility in discussions, suggesting that Ottawa has been unwilling to compromise on key issues. The breaking point came when Trump highlighted a Canadian advertisement from the province of Ontario that featured Republican icon Ronald Reagan extolling the benefits of free trade. The president interpreted the ad as a provocation, ultimately prompting him to terminate the trade talks late Thursday evening. In addition to disagreements over trade, Trump publicly accused Canada on Friday of attempting to influence the U.S. Supreme Court, which is set to review challenges to his global tariff strategy. This accusation signals that tensions between the two countries extend beyond simple trade disputes and touch on broader concerns about influence and fairness in international relations. Negotiations have focused in part on Canada's steel and aluminum sectors. The discussions followed the removal of most retaliatory tariffs on U.S. imports by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who sought to ease the strain left by measures imposed by his predecessor. Despite weeks of talks, Hassett admitted the discussions have been far from smooth. "The fact is that the negotiations with the Canadians have not been very collegial," he said in a Fox News interview. "They've not been going well. I think the president's very frustrated. He wants a great deal with Canada, just like he wants a great deal with Mexico." The situation underscores the ongoing challenges in U.S.-Canada trade relations, highlighting not only policy disagreements but also the personal dynamics and strategic tensions that influence high-level negotiations. While both sides have expressed a desire for a mutually beneficial agreement, the breakdown in talks signals that reaching a deal may take more time and political effort than originally anticipated. The tension had been simmering for weeks, perhaps even months, though no one in the public eye had fully grasped its depth until the moment it erupted. President Donald Trump, known for his impatience when negotiations dragged and his intolerance for what he perceived as intransigence, had reached a breaking point with Canada. The trade talks between the two neighboring nations, which were supposed to be a platform for collaboration and mutual benefit, had instead become a source of growing frustration and escalating irritation. On Thursday evening, in a move that caught many off guard, Trump abruptly terminated the discussions, signaling that the patience of the United States had worn thin. Inside the White House, the air was tense as advisors scrambled to explain the president's decision to the press and to the public. Kevin Hassett, the director of the National Economic Council, spoke candidly to reporters on Friday, painting a picture of negotiations that had consistently been challenging. According to Hassett, the frustration had been building over time, a slow accumulation of disagreements, rigid stances, and what the U.S. team considered a lack of flexibility on the Canadian side. For weeks, U.S. officials had engaged with their Canadian counterparts, attempting to navigate complex trade issues, especially in sectors like steel and aluminum, which had become flashpoints in the broader dispute. Yet every step forward seemed to be met with hesitation or counter-demands, leaving the American delegation increasingly exasperated. The final straw, as Hassett explained, came in the form of an unlikely provocation, a Canadian advertisement produced by the province of Ontario. In the ad, Ronald Reagan, the late Republican icon, spoke about the virtues of free trade. What might have been a harmless or even humorous nod to economic principles instead became, in Trump's eyes, a symbolic gesture of obstruction and perhaps even mockery. By Thursday night, after reviewing the ad and reflecting on the series of difficult interactions over the preceding weeks, the president decided to cut off the talks entirely. The move sparked immediate reactions in both Washington and Ottawa, with political observers scrambling to assess the implications. On Friday, Trump expanded on his grievances, accusing Canada of attempting to influence the U.S. Supreme Court ahead of a significant review of his global tariff agenda. Whether these allegations were grounded in evidence or were an extension of the president's broader strategic posturing, they only served to heighten the sense of urgency and tension surrounding the negotiations. Meanwhile, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney had taken steps to reduce friction, notably by removing the bulk of retaliatory tariffs on U.S. imports that had been imposed by his predecessor. The move had been intended to pave the way for productive talks, to signal a willingness to compromise, and to foster a more collegial atmosphere between the two governments. Yet even with these concessions, the talks remained far from smooth. Hassett described the discussions as anything but collegial, acknowledging that despite repeated efforts, progress was slow and frustrations on both sides had mounted. At the heart of the conflict were fundamental questions about trade fairness, national interest, and the limits of compromise. Trump, for all his brashness and unpredictability, remained committed to what he described as securing great deals for the United States, and Canada had become a test of that approach. Hassett drew parallels to other negotiations, noting that the president's desire for a favorable agreement with Canada mirrored his ongoing efforts with Mexico, where similar dynamics of patience, strategy, and occasional exasperation had played out. By the time the dust settled on Friday, the story of the failed talks had taken on a life of its own. Reporters speculated on the economic ramifications, political analysts debated the potential fallout, and ordinary citizens wondered what the abrupt end to negotiations would mean for industries reliant on cross-border trade. Behind the headlines, however, the most important drama was unfolding quietly in boardrooms, meeting halls, and private offices where U.S. and Canadian officials grappled with the delicate task of balancing national pride, economic necessity, and diplomatic decorum. For President Trump, the episode was emblematic of his approach to international relations: direct, often confrontational, and unwilling to tolerate delays or perceived slights. The termination of talks with Canada was more than a negotiation setback. It was a reflection of the high stakes he placed on trade and his insistence that America receive what he considered fair treatment. And as the two countries prepared to reassess their positions, one truth became clear: in the complex world of global trade, patience and flexibility were as critical as strategy and leverage, and the cost of missteps could ripple far beyond the boardroom. By Saturday morning, the reverberations from the abrupt end of U.S.-Canada trade talks had spread far beyond Washington and Ottawa, reaching boardrooms, factories, and farms on both sides of the border. Economists and market analysts were already weighing the potential consequences, while politicians in both countries tried to recalibrate their messaging to reassure their constituents. Yet behind the public statements and media coverage, a quieter, more intense drama was unfolding, one that highlighted not only the fragility of international negotiations but also the human temperaments that can make or break them. In the United States, President Trump's decision was seen as an extension of his broader trade philosophy, a relentless drive to secure deals that he could publicly declare as victories for American workers and businesses. To him, negotiations were not merely about rules and tariffs. They were about perception, leverage, and ultimately, winning. The Ontario advertisement featuring Ronald Reagan may have seemed innocuous to some observers, but to Trump, it symbolized what he viewed as Canada's obstruction and unwillingness to appreciate the stakes from his perspective. It was a reminder, in his eyes, that flexibility in negotiation was not merely desirable, it was essential, and without it, talks would inevitably falter. Across the border, Canadian officials faced a different set of pressures. Prime Minister Mark Carney and his team had attempted to smooth the path by removing the retaliatory tariffs imposed by the previous government, signaling goodwill and a willingness to compromise. Yet even with these gestures, the atmosphere remained fraught. U.S. officials described Canada's approach as rigid and unyielding, and the abrupt termination of talks underscored the limits of diplomacy when tempered by frustration and high-stakes politics. Behind the scenes, Canadian trade negotiators worked to maintain composure, aware that any misstep could inflame tensions further and potentially harm industries that depended on access to the American market. The economic stakes were enormous. Steel and aluminum, two sectors at the heart of the discussions, were not just commodities. They represented thousands of jobs, entire supply chains, and communities whose livelihoods depended on cross-border trade. Factories in Canada that had invested heavily to meet U.S. demand now faced uncertainty, while American manufacturers watched nervously, wondering whether retaliatory tariffs or trade restrictions might return. For ordinary workers and small business owners, the high-level drama in Washington and Ottawa was anything but abstract. It had real consequences that could be felt in paychecks, production schedules, and long-term